Yo, so we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition before I have to run and get my son from school today. So I have a unique approach to nutrition. So what I've done is I've accumulated all the research and education and practical experience over the past, probably really the past decade. And I've kind of come up with my own approach to nutrition. Obviously, before you get any nutrition program, go see your doctor, make sure that you're good to go as far as getting advice from a professional. So I have three approaches to nutrition, depending on the goal. So I have a health approach, performance approach, and I have an aesthetic approach, or the way you want to look approach to nutrition. Now, you can be in one approach and still see benefits from the other approach, but I'm going to talk about specifically you're looking for these specific things as far as your goals go. So now some things to consider in these different approaches. So in a health approach, we're going to consider things like inflammation, simple biology, your chronological age versus your biological age, and things like that. Other things, blood pressure, your blood glucose levels, your cholesterol levels, all those type of things. Even resting heart rate plays, is a really good determining factor of health. So a lot of things in there. Performance, very simple. You're looking for, typically you have an athlete that wants to run this fast, jump this high, or be this strong for the sport that they're playing. Aesthetics, how you look. You're either a bodybuilder, physique competitor, you're a bikini competitor, fig competitor, whatever that might look like for you. But basically, if you're just looking for one of those things, that's the approach I would take with you as your fitness professional. Now, within these approaches, there's two basic approaches to attack as far as the strategy goes. So you have a metabolic-based approach, and you have a glycemic-based approach. Metabolic-based approach has been the most widely researched over the years. This is what most people know as, some things that characterize a metabolic-based approach are, small, frequent meals throughout the day, maybe even eating every 2.5 to 3 hours throughout the day to speed your BMR up, which is your basal metabolic rate, which basically means you're trying to speed your metabolism up and to burn more calories at rest during the day or chew up more calories. Glycemic-based approach essentially is an approach that's really geared towards balancing insulin levels and blood sugar levels, and also taking advantage of the fat burning with that approach as well. So those are the two main approaches. Both of them work. Depending on the person I might be working with or you're working with, you might choose from either one of these. Most of our personal training certifications, most of our colleges really only talk about the metabolic-based approach as opposed to the glycemic-based approach. Okay, so some really things to keep in mind when we're talking about a glycemic-based approach. The things that raise your blood sugar up are going to be carbohydrates. So if we're trying to balance our insulin levels, paying attention to the carbohydrates, which most of you probably don't know that carbohydrates convert into sugar unless they're already in sugar form. So basically the life of a carbohydrate is this. So you start with a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are starches, fruits, and vegetables. Starches are things like bread, pasta, rice, oatmeal, candies, cookies, cake, ice cream, sweets, things like that. So when you have those things, the first thing that happens is they convert into something called glucose. Now, you have the opportunity to use glucose up as energy. If you don't use, or whatever you don't use as energy in the form of glucose, that's going to be converted into something called glycogen in the liver. Now, you still have an opportunity to use that up through exercise. We even use a certain amount of this just to survive every day. Now, whatever you don't use out of that in the insulin or in the liver, insulin's going to transport that into a fat cell. And essentially what we're trying to do is stay away from converting a lot of body fat. Board's falling down here. And most of us can probably afford to lose a little bit of body fat. Body fat really has no advantage in our life today as it is anyway. So really for survival purposes. Also, a little bit of extra fat might help with some leverage in certain sports, like if you're an offensive or defensive lineman, if you're a sumo wrestler. Probably not too many sumo wrestlers going to watch this, but anyway, so that's the path of a carbohydrate. So there's two ways to look at this. So it's either I want to try to get the right amount of carbohydrates, right? To keep and use the right amount of carbohydrates through training to keep myself from storing fat, or I just stick to certain carbohydrates, or I can really drastically limit them to keep this process from happening. The problem with that is, or what can be a problem is, all right, what energy you're going to get, where is your energy going to come from then, right? So now there's a lot of different debate on, what the best approach is. I've done just about everything with this. So some terms that you might know, ketogenic, paleo, South Beach, Atkins, there's all these different approaches. I'm not too concerned about the names of things. And we want to be careful to not be so dogmatic and get attached to certain terms of things. And that's not just a diet, but everything in life. That's a whole other topic we might discuss in another video. So basically all those approaches that I just mentioned are based on burning a high amount of body fat. Take the ketogenic diet, for example. We're trying to limit carbohydrates sometimes as low as 20 to 30 grams a day, maybe even sometimes lower, with dietary fat being up in the 60 to 70% of our diet. So, which that approach, if you can do it, works really well at balancing your blood sugar levels, and also it's virtually the best way to burn body fat. From my experience, it's very difficult for most people to handle that. It doesn't mean just because you can't get full-blown ketogenic doesn't mean that you can't experience the benefits from a low glycemic or a ketogenic diet, sorry. So you can still burn a ton of body fat not being in full-blown ketosis. Another thing, now that I'm on that subject, is there's certain levels of ketosis. And so if you guys have ever seen the back of a ketogenic urine strip box, you're going to see certain levels of ketosis. And ultimately, my goal for everybody I work with, if they fit into this health goal, they're going to be in that kind of that middle range on a regular basis as far as how many ketones versus glucose you're going to be burning. So now, to not make this a 3-hour lecture, if you have any questions about any of the stuff that we're talking about, obviously reach out to me, and I can answer your questions and everything. So, all right, so let's move on to, all right, what as far as our food goes, what percentages of everything should we be getting? Okay. You guys are probably having a hard time seeing this, so I'm just going to say it. So we have proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. These are called macronutrients. Macronutrients make up all foods. There is one other thing, actually. Alcohol actually acts as kind of its own macronutrient. I'll explain a little bit about that here in a minute. Protein sources, we're not talking about supplements here. We're just talking about food sources. So most of all of our protein sources are going to come from meats and eggs. Meats, things like chicken, fish, steak, any kind of meat, sausage, bacon, turkey, those kind of foods are where we're going to derive our protein from. Our fats, oils, coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, flaxseed oil, fish oil. Those are going to be our main sources of oil. Butter, avocados, seeds and nuts, cheese, and then also, I don't usually put this in here, but almond milk, cashew milk, coconut milk. Carbohydrates, if we're following a glycemic-based approach, we're going to want to primarily stick to vegetables, and primarily green vegetables. Those are going to be the most nutrient dense out of all the vegetables. And starches, safe starches. Things like sweet potatoes, quinoa, brown rice, and steel cut oats. So those are really, when you're following a glycemic-based approach, kind of the ones that you're going to want to be sticking to. There are more foods on that than the ones on that list. But yeah, so those are kind of the main foods that you're going to want to look for. What food should you be staying away from? Now let's tie this back to health. So, and we'll talk a little bit specifically about inflammation, biology, and chronological versus biological age. So things like, let's talk about inflammation first, since it's the first one I got up there. So there's a couple different kinds of inflammation. It's a kind of a vague term. So there is something called local inflammation that you get when you cut yourself, break a bone, bruise yourself. Inflammation is created in a certain part of the body to help speed up the healing process. There's also something called global inflammation, and this is the type of inflammation where it affects the whole body. And there's certain foods that we ingest that cause more inflammation than others. And these foods, at the top of the foods on the list, are going to be dairy products. and even alcohol would be up there too. So milk and the other dairy products like yogurt are going to have the highest inflammatory factor and create the most inflammatory response in your body. The next one down are going to be your high glycemic carbohydrates and starches. So sweets, really sugary things, donuts, even white starches, white rice, white bread, things like that. Those are going to create ice creams, a really highly inflammatory type of thing to eat. So essentially, the more inflammation our body has globally, the more we open ourselves to certain illnesses, the common cold, flu, bronchitis, pneumonia, short-term illnesses like that. And even research now is indicating that long-term inflammation, it can be leading to things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obviously type 2 diabetes, other kinds of metabolic syndrome, and on and on and on the list goes. So now linking inflammation into chronological versus biological age. So your chronological age is how old you are in years right now. I'm 35. Biological age is essentially how old our body is based on these things called telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, that you actually can get this tested. You'd have to do some research on Google in your area where you can get this blood work done. But essentially, these things called telomeres have a certain lifespan, and once the telomere dwindles down to nothing, that particular cell dies. I'm not an expert in that, but it does make a lot of sense to me. So there are some people that choose not to live the healthiest of lifestyles, where their chronological age might be 30, 35 years old, but they get some blood work done and it shows their biological age might be in the 40s or even 50s. So now the good news is you can reverse that. And studies have shown that you can reverse that pretty dramatically if you're choosing the right way to not just eat, but the way to live your life. Now, some other factors that influence the global inflammation levels. The first one we're talking about today is caloric stress, or the stress that you get through your nutrition. The other types of stress are going to be mental and emotional stress, and even physical stress. You can actually physically work to the point where your biological age goes faster, right? So you can work out too much, you can eat too much, and cause your biological age to increase as well. Okay, so last thing we'll talk about is, and this is a question I got from somebody today, how do I stop cravings? In the world that we live in today, it's hard to go, it's hard to even drive anywhere without going past a McDonald's, a Wendy's, a Burger King, or you might work somewhere, they have donuts in the break room. You might even be living with somebody that likes sweets and is not willing to maybe even give up the way they're eating. So there's the first thing I would say is, try to control your environment, right? So if you're in a position, whether it's at home or at work, you can make some adjustments as far as your environment goes. That's going to be the first thing. Most of us, the types of things that we crave are going to be sweets. So, there are things called artificial sweeteners out there. There is some research out there that obviously talks about aspartame, sucralose is Splenda is another name for sucralose. And there's a number of them. Stevia, they claim to be the best one. So do some research on artificial sweeteners. They've helped me with the sweet tooth cravings. Those can come in the form of sport drinks. They can come in, even a Diet Coke obviously isn't going to be the best option, but you can decide whether you're going to go for a regular Coke or a Diet Coke. In my opinion, go for the Diet Coke if you can. Really, sometimes you just got to suck it up until your body adapts to the new lifestyle and nutritional choices that you're making. So anyway, I'll leave you guys there. If you have any questions, let me know.